Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jean Badgelan here on Gaming Materialists, our monthly gaming show, a joint production between This Is Revolution and, of course, my very, very well known co host, the one, the only, C. Derek Vaughn. Vaughn, how are you doing today?
I'm okay. Happy to talk about.
Oh, is that a
Yes,
new? Is that a new? I have a new one too. Is that a new Warhammer Fantasy role play book you have there?
it
A
is
fourth edition. I actually have a ton of third edition Warhammer Fantasy role play, the edition that everybody hates,
the final flight
the
edition.
Fantasy Flight edition, which I
Fantasy
think
flight
is
edition,
pretty
yeah,
good. I think it's pretty good. I think the haters are going to hate because it's very different, but it was a good version of the game. But we don't need to dig up that unholy grave at this point in the day. So, as you have hinted, as you may have guessed from the thumbnail, we are going to be discussing Warhammer Fantasy. We do a lot of Warhammer on this channel because apparently people watch Warhammer videos and don't watch, well, they watch Dungeons and Dragons videos too, but uh, people love Warhammer content. And as a former employee of Games Workshop and a long time Warhammer player, I'm always happy to do that content. But we usually focus on 40K. Today, we're going to be discussing Warhammer Fantasy, which is dead, or is it dead? Well, we'll maybe get to that. And of course, we have a wonderful guest. We have a returning guest, the bane probably of Games Workshop's marketing team, the angriest, I would say, Warhammer YouTuber out there. Also, an author at Sublation magazine whose article on Warhammer and the working class was our number one article until Slavoj Žižek turned up. So it's a tough act to follow. So I wish I had the soundboard to do the applause, but Jason's the one who owns the soundboard. So please give it up in your mind for the one, the only Discourse Miniatures. Hey, Discourse, welcome.
Hello. That's some intro. I feel like I'm going into a boxing ring or something.
That is the influence probably of This Is Revolution's main host, Jason Miles, who
Ah.
he's a musician, he's a hype man, and
Ah.
I think he's I think it's beginning to rub off on everybody because he has a soundboard. Whenever anyone comes on, he does applause. So now when we don't have applause, it feels like the stream is naked.
Uh,
So
ah,
I
well,
think
I'm
Vaughn,
hyped. I'm
are you,
hyped. I mean, it worked.
well, good. I'm glad you're hyped, and you know, maybe in the future I will have my own soundboard, but I have some double glazing windows to pay for before I can afford the soundboard. So, Warhammer Fantasy. For those of you who are not familiar with Warhammer Fantasy, it is a setting created by Games Workshop in the early 1980s. It was Games Workshop, for those of you who aren't aware, originally was kind of an importer of Dungeons and Dragons before they started developing their own product lines. And one of their earliest product lines was the Warhammer Fantasy Mass Combat Rules, which I think came out in 1983. That was the first edition. And then, that game, as it developed, as with a lot of Games Workshop's products, it developed its own rich lore. We have a second edition in 1986, and then we have a role play game based on the Warhammer Fantasy IP, which was developing, which I think is 1987, which is something that Varn, I think, is more familiar with than the mass battle game. And then in the
correct.
90s, it was Warhammer Fantasy, I think, was, at least in the early 90s, was Games Workshop's leading IP. It was the first, if people remember from the 1990s, Games Workshop began doing these boxed beginner sets, which are aimed towards a younger demographic. It was actually Christmas 1992 where I received my first Warhammer Christmas present, which was the fourth edition, I want to say, third edition, fourth edition box set, The High Elves and the Goblins. And haven't looked back. But since that time, Warhammer 40,000 has come to eclipse Warhammer Fantasy, even though Warhammer 40,000 was originally a kind of spin-off of Warhammer Fantasy, using a lot of the same rule sets and a lot of the same races. You know, in the 90s, the sci-fi version of the game became more popular. There were subsequent editions of Warhammer Fantasy, one in 2000, one in 2006, and then an 8th edition, and the final edition for now in 2010, before Games Workshop literally, I guess, or metaphorically, I don't know what would be the word, the most appropriate word, blew up the Warhammer Fantasy setting in 2015. They did a big campaign send-off, the End Times, destroyed the Warhammer Fantasy world, and basically had a kind of reboot / continuation of the Warhammer story in Age of Sigmar, which is, although it has some kind of tenuous links to Warhammer Fantasy, is to all intents and purposes a new setting with far more copyrightable races and figurines and things like that. So
very convenient.
Very convenient for Games Workshop with their with the destruction of Warhammer Fantasy. So it's kind of an interesting setting which developed over an extended historical period, which has it caused quite a bit of emotional stir when it was gotten rid of. There's a famous video of a fellow burning his Dark Elf army, which apparently happened. Apparently, the guy goes to the local shop in Springfield because he's from northern Arkansas. He blew up his army. So people were upset about the destruction of Warhammer Fantasy, although there are rumors that it is coming back. So I kind of want to begin with you, Discourse, as you are our guest. You've talked about liking Warhammer Fantasy, been into Warhammer Fantasy. What was your introduction to the Warhammer Fantasy setting? Was it before 40K, or was it after 40K, or at the same time? How did you get to know the Warhammer Fantasy setting?
So Warhammer Fantasy is really weird. I'm on record now at this stage. Warhammer Fantasy, I think, in comparing 40K and Warhammer Fantasy, I think Warhammer Fantasy is the far better setting now, like without a shadow of a doubt. But at the time, I wasn't fussed on Warhammer Fantasy. I got into 40K, but I got into that through Dawn of War. I got into that through video games. So it wasn't sort of like I got like a Christmas present or anything like that. Like my family is far too poor to afford Warhammer. It would never have been a thought that would cross their mind, to actually play it. I played Dawn of War, and then I got really into Warhammer 40K. And that is how I got exposed to Warhammer Fantasy. And I wasn't interested in that game for the longest time. It took me, I don't think I got in to Warhammer Fantasy until like the late 2000s. So like 2009 or something like that, 2008. It took me a while to get into Warhammer Fantasy because I only had time for 40K. I was really interested in the setting of 40K. I was really interested in the world of 40K. And at the time it was kind of like, fantasy. Sort of felt like, in the one hand, it was almost like it was a little planet inside 40K. The stakes just felt so much lower. They felt so much less galactic, I guess, right? Like 40K is such a grand, epic setting. And as well as that, Warhammer Fantasy felt very musty. At the time, I was quite young. There was a time when I was very young, and at that time, Warhammer Fantasy didn't feel sort of very energetic. It didn't feel very vibrant. 40K definitely felt like there was a lot more going on. It was a lot more epic. It was a lot crazier in a lot of ways. Whereas Warhammer Fantasy just felt kind of like it was like one step removed from a historical game, which was not as appealing to me. It wasn't until really I started, I ended up, because I'm a mark, right? Like I get totally got by sales techniques. So I eventually got convinced, more than likely by a Games Workshop employee, to dip my toe. I think it might have been the Island of Blood set had come out. And I bought in with the Island of Blood set because I kind of like the idea of the Skaven. But then I bought an Empire army box. I got into the Empire that way because I collected Imperial Guard in 40K. So the Empire felt like a very natural sort of transition over into Warhammer Fantasy. And that's where I started with it. I really honestly didn't know much about Warhammer Fantasy at all. really, except for kind of like the barest minimum, because I hadn't indulged in any of the lore or the books or anything like that.
I think that's quite interesting that you at least initially found Warhammer Fantasy kind of musty, because I think
Yeah.
there is certainly, I think that's a kind of a fair assessment of where Warhammer Fantasy was as a mass war game,
Mhm.
where it was in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It was
Mhm.
not as dynamic or exciting as it had been in the early 90s.
Mhm.
As somebody who's probably like 10, maybe 12, 13 years older than you, when I got into Warhammer, it was through Warhammer Fantasy, and 40K until the second edition box set came out was
Uh-huh.
too complicated a game to play for a little kid. Warhammer Fantasy was kind of a complicated game, but it was definitely, they'd streamlined things for the box set edition. But I think Warhammer Fantasy increasingly became stale as a game
Yeah.
for a variety of different reasons uh, over the over an extended period, especially I think as generations changed. You
Mhm.
had a younger generation who were more into the science fiction setting as opposed to the fantasy setting, and then also Games Workshop was not supporting Warhammer Fantasy to the same
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah, it wasn't getting pushed as much at all. Like, it was very clear that their main game was Warhammer 40K, even at that time. Like in 2004, 2005, it was Space Marines. I mean, it's
Mhm.
still Space Marines, obviously, but by that time, I suppose like the Space Marinification of the setting had really occurred, where they were really pushing it very hard. And I think, obviously you'd seen it a little bit in the 90s, but by the 2000s, I think they're dabbling in licensing the IP into different media had really started to pay dividends, because Dawn of War was massive at the time.
Mhm.
This might not, I mean, for the younger people out there, real-time strategy games used to be the bomb. Okay, they used to be the thing that everybody
Mhm.
played, and Dawn of War was an incredible real-time strategy. It was so good, and it definitely exposed. I mean, I know people at school who were only exposed to the 40K setting as well because of the video games at the time. And Warhammer Fantasy had video games, but they had never
Shadow of the
quite
Horde
taken
Rat.
up. Yeah, they'd never
Shadow.
quite taken off, as far as I was aware, in comparison to some of those relic games.
Yeah, until very recently, of course, and
Well,
we'll perhaps
yeah.
get to that. Okay, Varn, what about you? So, again, Discourse and I obviously come from the United Kingdom, which is the ground zero for Warhammer. Um, but how about your exposure to the Warhammer Fantasy setting and how you became to be introduced to it?
Warhammer Fantasy came very, very late, and in fact, it was the Fantasy Flight game that everybody hates. It was my first introduction to it. Um, I actually discovered Warhammer through hobby shops had them, but they were far too expensive for me when I was in high school, and because you have to imagine they're already expensive, plus there's an import tax on them, so they're even more expensive in the United States. And it was not a popular hobby amongst young people here in the 90s at all. But the dawn of war games happened, and we started looking more and more into the Warhammer universe after the dawn of war games, and I found the Fantasy Flight game almost as soon as it came out, and we were fascinated with the world of it, because a lot of the things that show up in Warhammer 40K actually make more sense in Warhammer Fantasy.
Yeah.
So, and we worked backwards from there. So I remember trying to get a bunch of second ed Warhammer Fantasy stuff. I think Warhammer Fantasy's reputation in America amongst people slightly older than me and Eugene is actually pretty high, but but again, I think it was imports of the RP game as much as the tabletop the tabletop miniatures game. So
Yeah,
that's how I
because
got into it.
the role play game, I would say, although people forget about it, I think that was a way a lot of people got into it, because Games Workshop had originally been a D&D importer and content creator for Dungeons and Dragons, and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was their kind of in-housing of the roleplay aspect of the game, which I think was popular. And there's there was a big enough fan base for the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay when there was a gap between the Fantasy Flight 3rd edition and the 4th edition, which was Cubicle 7, that people created Zweihander, which was basically just the old system. So when we look at Warhammer Fantasy, obviously what comes to my mind is the rank and flank game, tabletop game, which I definitely think there's because it's a rank and flank, it had that musty feel to it.
Yeah, 100%. I think even like at the time as a kid, looking at the rank and flank, it felt like a more convoluted, a stranger game, like less free form, than because I was round to the round bases. Like my first introduction to miniature war, having to kind of stack everybody up in these big blocks of infantry and maneuver them really awkwardly around the map just felt very alien to me.
While they all fell off the bases. Yeah, exactly. And so, it fell off the movement trace. But of course, there were a lot of other Warhammer Fantasy products out there, especially in the 90s. So the role-play game, you got to remember Hero Quest. Hero Quest, which was the Milton Bradley joint Games Workshop game, was a huge phenomenon in the early 90s. It had TV adverts. People knew about that. There was Advanced Hero Quest, which was popular. There were other games like Mighty Empires, which was a strategy game, which I used to love. I'm trying to think of all the other products that they used to have. Blood Bowl, which is kind of American football style game, which is quite popular. Was a Warhammer Fantasy derivative. And then, of course, you did have the video games in the 90s, which I guess, for you, Discourse, you probably missed. But, things like Shadow of the Horned Rat, they were like pretty big, at least, for the time. They were like exciting games with like, good production values for the time. And, Warhammer Fantasy still had some vitality. I mean, you had spin-off games like Man-O-War, which was a Navy game, which they kind of rebooted with Dreadfleet. And then what else? What other games did they have? I would say there was Warhammer Quest, of course. That was another kind of game. And then War Master, which was one of my favorite games set in the Warhammer Fantasy world, which was a 10 mil version of the game, which is actually, you could do a rank and flank game without all the miniatures falling off the thing. So there was a lot of games around it, and a lot of different
Disc Wars. You forgot Disc Wars.
Oh, Disc Wars, yeah, with the zine. Oh my god, yeah, like
you flip so many
different games. But yeah, in the 2000s, it definitely fell off, and there was a kind of that it was cancelled as a setting seems to me have been sad, but a logical business decision.
There was a lot of elements to it, though. I mean, because aside from 40K just being flashier than Warhammer Fantasy in a lot of ways, and I guess having that poster boy of the Space Marines, Warhammer Fantasy never had anything like that. Like the closest thing that it had was maybe Chaos Warriors or the Bretonnian Knight, but those are. They are much more generic in a lot of ways, like an evil plate user, and they aren't as as a Space Marine ride. I mean, hence the Stormcast Eternals that then get brought in Age of Sigmar later on. But aside from that, there was also business decisions that had been taken by Games Workshop that did not make the game as accessible to people as well. So they required a lot of infantry, but they sold the infantry at a pretty significant price, and you didn't get a lot of them inside a box. So it was really tough to actually build a sort of 1,000, 2,000 point army. It was a very expensive endeavor. You really had to commit to it. Likewise, I think the gameplay suffered from the rank and flank maybe wasn't as strong as 40k at the time. I think maybe the game design was lacking a little bit. I haven't played Warhammer Fantasy in forever, but I do remember being frustrated at the gameplay of Warhammer Fantasy more times than 40k. If that was just a case of like alpha striking my opponent accidentally off the board. Sometimes, I mean, you're running a gunline Empire army, I guess. Maybe you should expect it a little bit more. But I remember 40k. I remember Fantasy being a much more frustrating experience than 40k, not only to collect but also to play.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. There was a lot more time investment to setting up and like learning how to play, and a lot more of a financial investment that you had to put in. But I want to turn a little bit to the aesthetic of 40k. So I wanted to ask you, Varn. So you got into Warhammer Fantasy a little bit later. What do you think? What strikes you as a kind of unique thing about the Warhammer Fantasy setting that attracts people to it? That makes it, even though it's derivative, just as all Games Workshop settings are completely IP derivative. What makes it an interesting setting? What attracted it to you?
It's a different kind of high fantasy. One, it's later medieval, early Renaissance. So between the 15th and 17th century, as opposed to some of the impossible timelines of D&D. If you're an early D&D player, it also had more storyline compared to like Gygax Dungeons. So if you're comparing it coming on the scene in like 87 to what D&D would have been in 87, which is the beginnings of Dragonlance and that sort of thing, you're shifting from like the Funhouse Dungeons to storyteller play. But the storyteller play in the way where D&D went is very Tolkien high fantasy, and you can't accuse Warhammer Fantasy of being that at all. It's a lot grimmer, it's a lot grittier, it's a lot easier to die, even than say second ed D&D. I mean, the lore to the world felt slightly bleaker. And at that now that we've been through the 90s and the aughts, we've had grimdark everything for several decades. But when I encountered this in the late 90s, early aughts, it was such a different tone than even say 3.5 D&D that it felt a little bit more like there was the stakes felt more real. You already had the tendency in D&D for by 3.5 for the superheroization of the characters, and this went in the opposite direction, and it felt really relieving. And I don't think it's insignificant. It kind of had a second wind about the same time the OSR was developing. So that's how I got into it. That's my impressions. But I've never touched the miniatures game because miniatures scare me. So
I would say it has this aesthetic, which in my mind, there's the kind of box art from the games, which is a little bit more cheerful, the 90s box art. But there is this kind of John Blanche art style where it's very like you see where 40k gets its grimdark from, which is from the fantasy game, because you have all this art from the 80s and 90s, which is very gloomy, very gothic. It's Renaissance, so it feels dirty. Everything seems dirty, like filthy. And with the role play game, especially, you don't have levels; you have character careers. So you could be like a peasant or
a rat catcher. My favorite
rat catcher, exactly.
Yeah, you get a small dog.
You get a small dog as a rat catcher. And although in the 4th edition, which I think is a kind of reimagining of the original editions, the element of like class war in the setting is like foregrounded a bit more. That was always there from the beginning,
Oh, there was the agitator class.
Yeah,
One of
you
my
could.
favorite. You could be the profession of an agitator, right? Handing out pamphlets. That's always fun to do in Bretonnia.
Yeah, hand out pamphlets in like the oppressive kingdom of Bretonnia. And over time the law kind of changed. Like originally Bretonnia was more like pre-revolutionary France before they kind of settled on the like everybody's inbred medieval backwater. King
Super
Arthur,
feudalism. Super
super
feudalism.
feudal,
90% of the food goes to the Lord. You get 10% and you can starve to death.
exactly. So what about you? What about you, Discourse? Like, why did you say at the outset you think compared to 40K, Warhammer Fantasy is the better setting?
So, I mean, in terms of, I think at first blush, Warhammer Fantasy does appear to be relatively generic. Like, there's not a huge amount that seemingly sets it apart, I think, if you just glanced at it. And that was kind of the impression that I got whenever I first got into the miniature game, right? I got into the miniatures game because it was another war game as opposed to me being like in love with the setting. It wasn't until I played the tabletop role-playing game, third edition not third edition, second edition, that I got really into the setting, that I really fell in love with it, because it was then that I was exposed to the sort of empire, the politics of the setting. Everything I'd known before then was just mostly vampire wars and chaos wastes. So it wasn't until I really got involved in the kind of empire politics that I loved it. I think in a lot of ways, the aesthetics of the setting, they actually kind of remind me of, I think the most quintessential Warhammer Fantasy movie is Verhoeven's Flesh and Blood. If you've ever seen that movie, I don't know why that movie is just Warhammer Fantasy the movie. It doesn't have a single like real fantastical element in it, but it is that could take place in the setting. And I think that's what I love about the Warhammer Fantasy setting. It's a high fantasy setting. There is magic in that world. Like, mountains look like skulls because the winds of chaos roll from the north over the mountains and it twists them into looking like skulls. The architecture is like absolute gothic horror, where there's buildings leaning over and there's wizards towers and there's massive armies of orcs. But at the same time, it still feels like a setting where the logistics are real and they are important, and the fact that there is a peasant tilling the field is legitimately important, and that there are beastmen raiding the farms is an issue that needs to be resolved. If you compare it to some other kind of maybe like D&D settings or even Age of Sigmar, I don't think that they ever quite managed to establish the same feeling of tangibility. And I think that's what I really love about the Warhammer Fantasy setting. It has a lot of, as a setting, it's very much defined by its political borders. You have the empire, you have different nations of the world, the empire, Bretonnia, Araby, then you have the dwarf kingdoms, the elves, and it feels like a very storied and lived in place where there is this vast history that have resulted in this very specific, very interesting political context that the game typically takes place in, usually in the empire, let's be honest, because it's a very Eurocentric game, but that is where you find yourself in. I don't think the same is quite true for a lot of other settings.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, you compare the Warhammer Fantasy setting with something like Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance. Warhammer Fantasy feels like there's a sociology of the society, and that society, it's ridiculous, but it also feels plausible in a way that it can function. Whereas in other settings like Forgotten Realms, it seems like it's a fantasy world without like a deep realistic feeling sociology to
it. I don't like high fantasy settings. Like, generally, I prefer kind of lower fantasy or low magic, I guess I should say, settings. Like Song of Ice and Fire, for example, is like one of my favorite fantasy settings, right? And that's a setting where magic isn't really that important, or that it's just coming back as kind of like a new thing. But with Warhammer Fantasy, that is very much infused with magic, but it still managed to hit that tone, that kind of grimier, muddier sort of feel that I just adore.
What about you, Varn?
Very similar. I mean, I think about in the mid-aughts, I played a lot of Warhammer Fantasy and a lot of Midnight. And Midnight's also it's similar in that it was a high magic setting and magic's gone. And so you have a all pervasive evil force looming everywhere. I think I think the sociology of it is interesting. I mean, because you do sort of wonder, when they tried to shift D&D, and I mean, effectively did into from its sword and sorcery funhouse dungeon origins into developed high fantasy worlds. You're like, who's holding these societies together? And how are they held together? Particularly when you get into like Faerun and Forgotten Realms, it's like the history here doesn't even make that much sense.
I've always struggled with that with D&D. I've always struggled with that.
Yeah, and I mean, Ed Greenwood, God bless him, has tried to do that with Forgotten Realms every now and then in Dragonlance they would kind of do that with the novels, sort of. But the other thing that is in Warhammer Fantasy is that maybe it's because those other two settings come from Americans, but there's no class in those settings at all, even though they're medieval settings. I mean, yes, there's kings, but there's not really class tensions. And even before, the last two iterations of it, you can't play Warhammer without class awareness. You just can't. Like, and so while in D&D you get the romantic side of feudalism, in Warhammer you get grim feudalism. It feels a lot more, just it feels a lot more impossible. And I think as a backlash to what gets instantiated in 4th ed D&D and in 5th ed D&D, which is like the total superheroization of the character, Warhammer holds on because being an expert watch catcher is cool. You can do, but it's not the same as a 20th level sorcerer. And it's impossible. I think it's also fairly impossible to be a godlike character in Warhammer Fantasy, which it also differentiates it from Age of Sigmar, frankly.
Yeah. You can't be a godlike character, but it's really more of a sort of professional, as like a high priest or something like that, or it's almost like an institutional role that you become to adopt because you become like a high ranking wizard, perhaps, and you suddenly become a political figure just by merit of the power. Whereas I don't think the same is quite true in D&D, where you're just simply, politically, you're just the best fighter in the world, and that is it now, or you're the best wizard, and there's like no assumptions about what that means, about the implications of that at all.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point there, because all the way when you play the role play game, at least you are grounded in the society. You aren't kind of an external MacGuffin going around doing dungeons. You have to like operate in this complicated world. That's how the scenarios were done for the Warhammer Fantasy role play game, and that's how the books were treated. It was very much this grounded. You are a player in a world. Insofar as in D&D, your character could be in any setting. It doesn't really matter. Whereas in Warhammer Fantasy, your character is like an innate part of the setting. And people today, from the vantage point of 2022, will be like, well, it's very Eurocentric and blah, blah, blah. But, it's like, well, these were just a bunch of like, counterculture white guys in Nottingham in the 1980s. Like, what do you expect them? What do you expect them to be writing about? But it was a fascinating setting that was, was kind of let down by Games Workshop not realizing the potential, because after all, after about 2008, Games Workshop farms out the role-play game, which was probably the most lively part of the Warhammer Fantasy IP. There was a lot of source books put out by Black Industry, really good ones. The Kislev source book, I remember, was a really good one. When I was at university, I used to go down to Forbidden Planet in London and just read the source books in the back shelves of the shop. They were just very well designed, interesting products. And one thing we haven't talked about is also the novels that went along with the Warhammer Fantasy. Everybody's used to the old 40K novel, which I would say most 40K novels are like pretty bad. But, there were some really good Warhammer Fantasy novels. The Felix and Gotrek series was kind of iconic for giving you a feel of that grimdark fantasy where it feels plausible, believable. The novel series begins with them, Felix, the kind of empire, like Renaissance noble, and Gotrek's the dwarf slayer, an iconic figure from Warhammer Fantasy. On the run from the authorities because they'd participated in a bread riot. And, that's like how it all opens up. Or you have Genevieve the vampire, where I just remember one thing is like the worshippers of chaos are trying to like make propaganda to destabilize the empire. And like the assistant to the chaos sorcerer is like, well, we're telling them about this kind of like brutalities that are happening to the peasants. And the chaos priest is like, what delicious lies. And the guy's like, oh, no, this is all real stuff that they're doing to the peasantry. So, and like the main character is stuck begins the story in a debtor's prison. So it's got this, like you say, it's this really interesting combination of high fantasy magic in a dirty, filthy, grimdark world, which I think people often describe it as low fantasy, but it really isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's what works really well in that setting, that it manages to combine those two things and get people who are interested in both to enjoy it. And I think that works really well in certain contexts for sure. Because I would write off most other, like I'm not interested in the D&D settings really. Not enough to like read, a book set in them at least. Whereas Warhammer Fantasy, it got me, And I think it is, I think it is the fact that it takes a very cynical perspective of the world, but then in a lot of ways feels more truthful. So you're talking earlier about how there's no concept of class, for example, or there's no concept of how the world itself is put together. But with the Empire, for example, it's a very complicated political institution. You have the elector counts, and they're consistently acting the way you would imagine people in their positions acting in the real world. That is to say, they're constantly warring with one another and trying to determine that they themselves should be the best one. I think one of my favorite stories from Warhammer Fantasy is the Emperor Dieter, who attempted to fund a war to go against the Border Princes, which is a kingdom kind of far to the south of the Empire. He tried to fund this war. He decided to tax the beer and sausages. And as a result, he was deposed by riots. A revolution occurred. The kingdom of Marienburg succeeded from the empire, and the elector counts had to quickly get rid of him and put a new emperor in charge of a completely different lineage. And that's just a fascinating little snippet of history just in the past to explain why this like kingdom situated between Bretonia and the empire is just this fully independent nation because of the sausage riots like 100 years ago.
And it's ruled by Margreta, who has the support of the burghers and the small business people.
Yeah.
Which was a reference to Margaret Thatcher being a kind of Margaret Thatcher style thing. So yeah, I think it's this fun setting, which there is humor in it, right? There's definitely humor in it, but it's a kind of dark humor. So how would you say the Warhammer Fantasy setting stacks up with this new Age of Sigmar that they have?
I don't know. Like, so I feel very, I have tried to get really into Age of Sigmar. Like I have read the Cities of Sigmar Codex. I have read the rulebook, fluff. I'm aware of the setting now. Cause I had written it off, to be perfectly frank. Like I had written it off. I was a little bit bitter. I wasn't like burn my army bitter, but I was a little bit bitter at the destruction of Warhammer Fantasy, but I got over it. I think the, Total War Warhammer really helped that, but I kind of got over it. And I think that in terms of stacking up beside one another, I don't think that Age of Sigmar kind of has the depth, right? So I mentioned earlier that Warhammer Fantasy was very much defined by the political borders. As a setting, it's very much about what is happening at the edges between these different nations. With Age of Sigmar, it feels more like the game is about its geography or its magical borders, because the world of Age of Sigmar is kind of situated based on the different magic. You've got the land of Gur, which is the land of beasts, and then you have the land of fire, for example. It's all very elemental in that sense. And I mean, that's kind of interesting, but it's not as interesting to me as there is a political society here that exists because of this shared mythos. I think that's just a much more interesting setting. Likewise, I mean, in terms of one thing I will say, and I think this is like totally unintentional, but there is a subtext to Age of Sigmar that is deeply problematic and pretty fashy, I would say, pretty fashy. There's this underlying assumption to Age of Sigmar that Sigmar himself is good, or that he's smart in some way, and that he creates these automatons known as the Stormcast Eternals, who are basically his
Space
personal.
Marines.
Yeah, they're fantasy space marines, and they are formulated from the heroes of the past and all these different other worlds, and they're forged on his anvil into these new perfect bodies, and they are sent out to do the will of Sigmar. Whether or not that includes enforcing the laws of Sigmar, I don't know if that I haven't indulged in the setting as much as that, but certainly to do the will of Sigmar, and that this is perceived in the setting as pretty much just a pretty well, that makes sense kind of way. It doesn't make sense. Why? But you have this entire nation, all of humanity are run by Sigmar himself. Like, he is the head of state. He is the nation state and leader all in one. He is the mythology of that entire world. And there's this subtext to the entire setting that this is just fine. And it's not examined. Whereas I would say that Warhammer Fantasy has a lot to say about how people are ruled, what systems we use to govern us. I mean, the Bretonian system is ridiculous. Like 90% of the food goes to the Lord, 10% goes to the peasant. But at least it dealt with the ramifications of that. There were peasants who took up arms against their lords and were absolutely, they'd be hanged if they were ever caught, right? Like this was dealt with in the setting. It was fleshed out in that way. But Age of Sigmar has nothing to say about that. Age of Sigmar has no real opinion on these ideas at all.
Yeah, I got the feeling that Age of Sigmar is written to be a miniatures game, and that's one of the advantages of Warhammer Fantasy that we were talking about. But I've been thinking about this whole time is like, how does any of this translate to the miniatures version of this? And it doesn't. It can't. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, it's there. One of the interesting things about Age of Sigmar, though, that I also agree with is even in 40K, it is clear that it is at some level of satire, even if people missed a joke. I don't get any feelings of it being a satire in Age of Sigmar at all. It's just it just removes any moral complications from the war game and the war game's backstory. I can also tell you, having played the Age of Sigmar RP, it doesn't really work as an RPG, which mirrors a problem that you see in 40K. Warhammer Fantasy is a great RPG. It's a felt world. We've talked about it all the time, and it kind of feels like we're not talking about it as the miniatures game. Whereas when you try to convert Age of Sigmar into a role-playing game, and Cubicle 7 has tried, and I have several of the books back there, it doesn't really work. What do you like, particularly when you're playing like Eternals or whatnot? What do you even? You don't really have agency. So what's going on here? And it feels like there's kind of a mishmash in the two, and like the world building element, which is very good for the RP, but it just doesn't really matter so much for the miniatures game versus the miniatures game needing some kind of clearer, cooler models. I mean, because who wants to there's no rat catcher in a miniatures game. So.
Copyrightable miniatures. I mean, that was one of the problems Games Workshop had, was the people who were still playing Warhammer Fantasy, they already had all the miniatures. There's like only so many different sets of Empire halberdiers that you can do, and you can buy historical miniatures to fill
They're
in for
easily
most.
they can be easily proxied, right? You can sell a knight, but why would I buy that knight? I can, like, right now I could buy some Perry knights for like a
Way
tenth of the
less.
cost, which is why at Age of Sigmar you'll see like no horses really. You'll see plenty of like magic monsters and kind of strange mounts and very specific models, but you won't see that in, you won't see like just a guy on a horse, because like you can get that anywhere, right?
Well, you can still get the Empire Pistoliers. I do have
Well, you can't. Yeah, but
for now.
Right, exactly, for now, because
Once they've got rid of their backstock of Empire's Pistoliers, they will be phased out the game pretty quickly, I would say.
100%. I mean, they're doing a refresh of Cities of Sigmar soon, so I think we're going to see the end of a lot of the old Warhammer Fantasy miniatures. I don't think we're gonna, they're gonna just be gone really from Seal.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of. I think you nailed it. Honestly, I mean, obviously, I think the way I would describe Age of Sigmar is sterile. It is a sterile setting it's kind of designed for a war game, and it is, whereas Warhammer Fantasy setting evolved both as a tabletop game and a role play game in tandem. And even when we go back to the earlier versions, the pre-1992 versions of Warhammer Fantasy, those were more narrative-led. They were less of a rank and flank and more of a narrative-led kind of affair, which meant that story mattered. And of course, now, I mean, like, like we forget that origins, but I think that is very critical to understanding why, Age of Sigmar is designed with a very much business, like how can we get miniatures that are unique, that it's hard for other companies to copy, and, how do we extract money from people?
Oh yeah, like Warhammer Fantasy, I think feels very organic. That it has evolved over a long period of time, whereas Age of Sigmar feels mandated in a lot of ways. Not only because they had to sort of they had to introduce miniatures, they had to make use of the old Warhammer Fantasy miniatures in their setting. So you get like weird factions, like the faction that consists of nothing but slayers. And therefore you've now got this faction of naked dwarfs, just all of them wielding an axe, and it's just bizarre. It's like, why is this a fact? Like, this should not be a faction at all. This worked as a single unit in a coherent society, but not as just this is meant to be some sort of mainline faction that you can collect. But also, there's obviously been a lot of mandates in terms of the design. Like you say, it has been from the ground up designed as a miniature war game. They're basically, what kind of factions can we have here that they can fight one another, and they can conceivably, everybody can fight everybody, which is a noble enough goal. I'm not saying that because something has been designed for some other purpose, like some setting has been designed for some other purpose, doesn't mean that it's not art, or that it can't be interesting in and of its own right. I just feel like it very much wears it on its sleeve. Everybody, I think, knew the moment that the Stormcast Eternals were revealed that this was just the equivalent of Space Marines, that this was a purely marketing exercise, that the Games Workshop had realized that 40k did really well and the Space Marines sold really well, and so therefore in their fantasy setting they had to have something like the Stormcast Eternals. Whereas it's just a pity, actually, because I think Stormcast Eternals are very interesting, but they have been I think they've been designed badly to, like, I don't think they quite represent what they're meant to be in the lore. They should be all individual heroes, not kind of the same person wearing uniforms.
I think, and I think also it matters that Games Workshop was deliberately aiming this game at a younger audience.
Yeah.
Because they want to get people into Warhammer, into the Warhammer hobby, as they call it, into their ecosystem,
into their clutches.
And as much as they try and tone down the 40k setting to make it more family friendly, it's like you can't go so far with like making the Warhammer 40,000 setting this kind of fascist dystopia, like kid friendly. I mean, they have those like kid friendly board games and stuff like.
They have the pictures and all the art design on their marketing as well.
But it's like, this is just like it's a bizarre prospect.
Well,
And I
they don't want to alienate an inbuilt audience that they've already acquired, right? Like they can't just go all out and be like, okay, well, actually, the Imperium's goody now, and don't worry about it, because they know that they've got all these Space Marine players who'll be like, they will not be happy. They'll be burning their armies, right? But Age of Sigmar was a good opportunity for them to try and just sort of try something new and just start from the ground up, building that kind of very family-friendly setting.
Family friendly, no moral ambiguity.
Yeah.
Stormcast Eternals. Everybody is. It's kind of interesting that this is the setting that represents the default family friendly kind of world. Because what does it tell us about our society that we like these like very clear. We all want Sigmar to come and save us, and there is the notion of a good king out there, whereas that moral ambiguity of Warhammer Fantasy is both attractive to people because of its realism or its truthfulness, as you said, but not really. When your character in Warhammer Fantasy can die of like hepatitis, it doesn't seem such a magical world.
I've had characters in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game who have starved to death, and I don't think I would ever have encountered that in Age of Sigmar. You get lost in the mountains, you wander enough time, eventually you die.
Have you ever had a character die of starvation in Warhammer Fantasy, Varn?
Starvation, no, but exposure to the elements, yes. So which I think has come up once in a modern D&D game. So,
it's that kind of setting, though. I mean, like I've had characters who have been hit awkwardly, fallen, hit their head on the pavement, and died. Right? Or
so easy
it can
to
happen.
die in Warhammer Fantasy.
It really is.
Or to be perma-maimed, like that's also possible.
Yeah. But that's kind of the beauty of the setting, right? That it kind of reminds you that life is precious and that you need to be careful with it. Age of Sigmar, I don't know what happens when you die. This is one of those things that people say all the time. They're like, oh well, the Stormcast Eternals are really important. Like they're actually very human. They're very kind of, they've got a lot of depth to them because when they die, they lose a little bit of their personality when they're reforged. And it's like, what? Dude, that's not how you add depth to a character. They're still superhuman, And well, I think it was interesting what you were saying about how this is what we perceive of as family friendly, because this really was an attempt to sanitize. I think this was like a very sanitized, like clean. Here are the good guys. They're all in golden. Don't think about it. And here are the baddies. They're a bunch of dirty beasts. Don't think about it. Off you pop. Go enjoy. And there is a subtext to it that I think that people don't really acknowledge, because I think that there's this perception in the general community. I don't know if we're getting a little bit off topic here, but there's this perception in the community that Warhammer Fantasy appeals more so to sort of grognards, maybe to the far right, for example, whereas Age of Sigmar is conceived of as being almost like this almost more leftist utopian sort of idea of society, when I think it couldn't be further from the truth. I think that it's quite the opposite, in fact, textually. I don't think it was intentional, but it is in the subtext.
It's very neoliberal. It's authoritarian, but it's diverse because you have black Stormcast Eternals, you have women Stormcast Eternals, but it's still an authoritarian system. It's just with a more diverse ruling class, whereas there was never really an attempt to make the Empire or Bretonnian ruling class good guys, right? They were not very
half
good.
of them were mad as well. When you look at when you read the fluff, like half of them are nuts, talking to their horses and riding off into the woods by themselves.
So let's kind of get to the last topic then, the future of Warhammer Fantasy. So Warhammer Fantasy was abolished in 2015, probably in retrospect at exactly the wrong time, because we had the emergence of Vermintide, which was a very popular first-person co-op game set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. There's now a second Vermintide. And then, of course, there was the Total War take on Warhammer Fantasy, which has proved extremely popular. It's now in its third game. Seems to be like a decade-long process of bringing these games out with, most of the armies. And of course, the role-play game is back as well. Fantasy Flight lost the license, and then Cubicle 7 picked it up. And Cubicle 7, I've got a couple of the books, but they've done a very nice starter set, and they have a very faithful, I would say, reinterpretation of the first and second editions with the percentile system. And what the one thing I find very interesting about it is that it kind of keeps the grimdark flavor, but one area it doesn't is it's kind of gender neutral, that there are women and men there's like gender equality in the Warhammer Fantasy world, which I'm not inherently bothered about. I'm sure that triggers I don't remember one of the
Grognards are probably triggered. Yes,
I saw a video of. I think it might have been the much beloved Warhammer Arch complaining about like women and 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy going woke. But it is an interesting design choice where you've cut the class conflict in place, you've kept the dark setting, but now it's like men and women are equal in the society and fulfill the same roles.
In fairness, like Warhammer Fantasy never had anything interesting to say about that. Like, that's fine, but just have something interesting to say, in my opinion. It had no opinion on that. It just assumed that there would be a gender divide because historically that's how it turned up in our world. But beyond that, there was nothing to say. Like, I think it makes sense in Bretonia because they actually have interesting things to say about the role of knights and women and and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting take, which I think I think it makes the game interesting. I think it would be interesting, especially in the role play game, if they actually tackled why a society like the Empire had a gender equality rather than just having it in the background. I think that would be cool. But Warhammer Fantasy is popular. What would you say how have Vermintide and Total War impacted the kind of interest in the Warhammer Fantasy setting?
I mean, personally, I don't think it can be overstated how much it actually saved that setting, like utterly and completely re-energized the entire setting. I don't think I've ever seen the setting be as popular as it is right now, which is kind of funny because it's gone. Like you say, Games Workshop sort of ended Warhammer Fantasy at the exact wrong moment, because as soon as they did, it was Vermintide was really big, but I think it really was Total War Warhammer 2 or Total War Warhammer that really energized it. To be honest, I mean, I think that in terms of the future, I would love to see Creative Assembly take more of a hand in the shaping of the game more, because they've been working really closely with Games Workshop to add in factions that we hadn't seen get added before, like Kislev, Cathay. There's talk of Ind, Koresh. I wanted Araby, but I don't think we're ever going to see Araby.
It's nonsense as well, because there was an Araby army in Warmaster. People forget this. There was an Araby army in Warmaster.
We have the old world obviously coming out, the miniatures game. What that looks like in the end, I'm not too sure. I suspect that it won't be a Forge World game, because I think that generally Games Workshop are looking to quietly sort of close down Forge World a little bit. I don't think they really care for that distinction anymore. I think that the old world's going to be a Games Workshop product, and I'm hoping that it'll be plastic as well. So I think that it's going to come back, but it's going to be closer to the Horse Heresy in scope. I suspect that it's not going to be quite as big or as expansive as Age of Sigmar. Like, I don't think it's ever going to take over as the fantasy flagship again, the way that it used to be. Also, I mean, it must be said that a lot of people who are interested in Warhammer Fantasy are like really interested in it, but the prices will completely dissuade them from ever trying to pick it up as a miniature war game. It's just the reality of Games Workshop pricing is that the vast majority of people there are used to paying like £10, £20 for DLC that adds the entire faction, and they can play it for as long as they want. That's all good. That wouldn't even get you a squad in Warhammer Fantasy.
And I wonder how, and also a lot of the older players, they switched over to Kings of War, which is a perfectly adequate game, and you could get pretty okay miniatures, and they've got the halfling, they've got the Empire halflings. I mean,
We have like the
People-
ninth age as well and stuff like.
Yeah.
There's like fan versions now of the game too.
But I think it's going to be interesting once the old world game comes out, how they're gonna skin that, what kind of armies they're going to bring back. It looks like from the art they're going to bring back armies that weren't really supported in the original run of the game. They may bring some of the games, the cafe games, but like you said, the popularity is going to be really shaped by the price. And I think what people don't realize is, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this, Varn, too, it's people don't realize how quick very successful companies can go under. And Games Workshop is playing a very high risk strategy of of upping its prices, trying to maintain a luxury product thing when it faces two really distinct problems, which is A, a cost of living crisis around the world, and B, the fact that if it is going to rely on inverted commas whales, even if, let's say, 80% of those whales continue to act like whales for Games Workshop, if 3D printing just peels off 10 to 15% of those people who were the big spenders, that could spell doom for Games Workshop. And plus, they've made some pretty unwise decisions, especially, I would say, Warhammer Plus, which seems to be a very expensive white elephant for the company. Yeah. So the question is going to come down is like, could this setting, just like the 40K setting, could it survive the collapse of Games Workshop? What would you think would happen to the Warhammer Fantasy IP, the Warhammer Fantasy IP, were Games Workshop to collapse?
It would, it'd be a free for all, and we have to ask ourselves, it's valuable IP, but it's already been somewhat spun off from Warhammer because Games Workshop doesn't really produce it for itself anymore. And I do think there's I feel like half the episodes of our show is me or some guest explaining how this company, which seemed invincible, just completely collapsed in a couple of years. Enter White Wolf Games, enter TSR, enter. But I think it might. What'd be interesting is I don't think the same people. It would be highly unlikely that the same people who got who would get, say, 40K would get Warhammer Fantasy, and thus you'd have IP complications immediately.
Do you think so? Do you think it would be unlikely for the same buyer, like Wizards of the Coast, as the
well,
example?
if it's a big company, no, I do. Yeah. Like if Wizards got it, then if Hasbro or something got it, then no, I think it would be batch bought. But if it's like what's happened to, I think about what happened to White Wolf Games, where there's still debates over who owns the rights to certain related same world IPs right now, because the rights have been spun off in so many different directions, and this part of this game series is bought by this people, and this part it's bought by these people, and they're not. I mean, it's almost like a miniature version of the problem that Marvel Comics has with the MCU. There's just elements of it they can't bring back together because of prior deals, and you wonder, well, what is the exact deal that Cubicle 7 has with Games Workshop? Like how much new IP are they developing themselves? And so far, not a lot. Actually, looking at it, it seems mostly reimaginings of old Games Workshop IP. But you could see this becoming a white fiasco unless, and this actually probably would be what happened, Hasbro bought it. But then it's gonna be like Dungeons and Dragons. So,
oh no, oh no.
Who would? Who else could buy it?
Out of the frying pan into the fire scenarios, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's monopoly capitalism. I think you know this is the inevitable endpoint of capitalism, as we're seeing a contraction in the board game and game and toy market.
Video games as well, like amazingly, not EA. is up for, is being bought by other. I never thought I would envision a world where there was a video game company bigger than EA that could actually buy out other companies. Just absolutely ridiculous.
And Hasbro is probably the only one in the marketplace who could really conceivably afford to purchase Games Workshop, unless some other private investment firm or some other like left field character came out and bought Games Workshop. But
another toy company that secretly owns everything, like Milton Bradley.
Well, I mean, who could do it? Like if something random like a media company bought it, or something like that. But it's most likely, if it's going to be sold, it'll be something like Hasbro, who already has foot in the door.
That is an interesting point, though. Think about what happened with White Wolf, because it was Electronics Games Company that bought half of it, and then that's what started the spiraling IP issues, actually, because they bought one property, didn't use it for what they bought it for, sold that portion of it, but then they had to untangle all the connected rights to other things. That could easily happen if something outside of the gaming industry bought Games Workshop. And I could see something like maybe a mid-tier video game company wanting to buy it up. Maybe Creative Studios wants to keep it, and maybe also wants Warhammer 2. That those are the kinds of scenarios that could happen. That the issue is, though, Creative Workshops wouldn't have the infrastructure for the miniatures market. However, 3D printing, maybe it doesn't matter anymore.
You look at the amount of influencers out there these days coming up with their own miniature war games. They're if they can do it, right? It's actually not as bad. I mean, you just need to get an ejection tool and kit. Off you pop, get a couple of molds out there. There's plenty of freelance designers. Away you go.
I mean, think about where it will be in like 5-10 years and how it will affect the hobby. And it's not just, I wouldn't say it's just 3D printing, but if you look at the ability of small companies to produce plastic miniatures, right? Like high quality, like hard plastic miniatures, it's easy. You go and get them made in China. You get the design done. You end up doing something like Atlantic War Games does, where they do perfectly like serviceable, like miniatures, which are way cheaper. So
they're vertically integrated. They're vertically integrated as well, and they do outsource. So there are smaller companies who use them to print out minis for them. Or I should say, produce rather than print.
Well, yeah. Well, we have been going for 1 hour and 7 minutes. We've been taking Discourse's time. I hope you're not way past your bedtime.
No, not yet. I could probably stream after this. It'll be grand.
You're gonna? Oh well, perfect. You stream some. What are you gonna stream? Anything exciting?
Probably just World of Warcraft, to be honest. Although I'm tempted to maybe start streaming some of that Return of Reckoning. All this talk of Warhammer Fantasy just make me want to play some Warhammer Fantasy MMO.
No Vermintide? No Vermintide?
Vermintide is frying my CPU at the minute, so that's kind of rough.
Oh, okay, fair
Good game,
enough.
Though. Any excuse to kill Skaven, I'm always up for it.
Skaven, for those who don't know, are one of the few, I would say, original IPs that Games Workshop came up with their Fantasy 7, and they're the rat people. They're kind of like rat engineers, which are kind of cool.
And they're just one massive joke on capitalism and fascism working together, hand in hand.
Working together, the corporatist structure of Skaven society. Well, Discourse, anything to plug? Anything going on?
No, you can just check out my channel, Discourse Miniatures on YouTube. I have a video out every 4 days or so, talking about miniatures, talking about Warhammer, talking about everything related to the miniature wargaming hobby. Check it out. I also stream on twitch.tv/Discourse Games. And I have a Twitter as well, which is Discourse Minis. So there you go. That's everything I think I got.
There you go. Well, we will actually have to get you back on sometime down the road to talk about Vampire, because we need. I think we do need to go back to the old. Varn is very into his emo 90s vampire, and he's like you. He thinks Requiem is better than Masquerade, but
yes, entirely it is. And You're so wrong about Masquerade being better. Requiem is obviously the better one.
Which vampire clan are you then? Like, what's the name? Varn is definitely a Bruja from Masquerade because he's angry all the time.
I'm a hunter. I don't go in for the into the vampire clans. I go for Hunter the Reckoning. That's the splat I prefer. Yeah,
there you
that's
go.
my favorite
My
one.
splat is mage. So.
Oh, mage. Wow. Okay. There is a very tough game to play. That is a very hard game to play.
It's good for people with imaginations, though. If you've got a good imagination.
I've killed mine by playing in the Warhammer ecosystem for too long. I don't know how to imagine things anymore. I just have to do what it says on the page.
Oh dear. Varn, anything exciting coming out on VarnVlog soon?
Well, it'll be already available by the time this releases. We have a history of the Codornes Industriales in Allende, Chile, coming out. By the time this comes out, it will be last week, but tomorrow from today. We have on the podcast only feed, but the free podcast only feed, we have a retrospective of underrated female directors, mostly either African American or French for some reason. I don't know why I ended up that way. We have, I don't know, I have like 20 episodes I've already recorded that are coming out in the next 2 months. So
yeah, every time I turn YouTube on, it's like VarnVlog's going live. I'm like, how does Varn have all this time? You know, I guess because
it's summer.
It's summer and you're a teacher, so all you do is record podcasts now. Well, guys, that's all for this month. But next month, I'm sure me and Varn will think of something exciting to talk about and find some exciting guests to bring on. But with that, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.